America belongs to we the people. It does not belong to the Congress. It does not belong to the special interest groups. It does not belong to the courts. It belongs to we the people. John Jay.
Oh, hi! Mr. Lahasky here. And today, we're going to take a close look at the first great debate in American political history, whether or not to adopt the United States Constitution. When we last left our intrepid founders, they were emerging from the Grand Convention in Philadelphia with a brand new form of government in hand, one that significantly strengthened the federal government in an attempt to rectify the problems that beleaguered the Articles of Confederation. And while many of us today hold the Constitution in the highest regard, that certainly wasn't the case in 1787. The size and strength of the proposed federal government under the Constitution invoked bad memories of British misrule in the minds of many Americans. The debate led to the first major political factions in our country's history, and those factions provided the foundation for the first political parties. Indeed, the echoes of this great debate can be heard even today. So let's get started with a big question. Can the U.S. Constitution protect against tyranny? This is essentially the question the founders were faced with near the close of the 18th century, and frankly, it has yet to be fully answered. The Constitution has held up for over 230 years, albeit with some significant changes along the way, but it's constantly being tested. Each of the last two presidential administrations has significantly expanded the power of the executive. The Obama administration used executive orders in ways previously reserved for the legislative branch. And the Trump administration defied many of Congress's oversight privileges during the impeachment investigation of 2019. But these recent examples aren't the only ones. FDR vastly expanded the scope of the federal government during the Great Depression. Abraham Lincoln defied the Bill of Rights during the Civil War, and Andrew Jackson flat out ignored the Supreme Court when they ruled against him on Indian removal. There's no doubt that the size and strength of the federal government has grown steadily since the Constitution was first ratified. Will we one day reach a tipping point and slip into a post-democratic autocracy? Let's hear from the founders, then you decide. Our first big idea sets the stage for the great debate over the U.S. Constitution. Initial reaction to the Constitution was mixed, and the debate over ratification dominated the national conversation. Remember, when the delegates were sent to the Grand Convention in 1787, they had been instructed by their states to revise the Articles of Confederation. But when they got behind closed doors, they decided to scrap the Articles and start from scratch. Most political conventions of the 18th and 19th centuries were open to the public, and also to reporters. But this one wasn't, and that was unusual. It also meant that when the delegates emerged with a brand new form of government in tow, people were shocked and a little suspicious. Many argued that the document was extra-legal and should be discarded outright. After all, the delegates were not given the authority to build a new government, only to edit the current one. Some rejected the Constitution on its merit, postulating that it was a blueprint for despotism. On the other hand, a few thought the Constitution a worthy replacement for the ineffectual Articles of Confederation. But in order for the new Constitution to go into effect, 9 of the 13 states would need to approve it. As the political jockeying began, factions coalesced around the Constitution. The Federalists supported the Constitution adoption, and the Anti-Federalists opposed it. The arguments of each faction is laid out in our second big idea. The Anti-Federalists feared the Constitution made the government too powerful and would infringe on liberty, while the Federalists argued that only a strong central government could effectively protect liberty. It's important to point out here that the Federalists and Anti-Federalists were factions, not political parties. Political parties organize people based on their position on a wide variety of issues that span economic, foreign, and domestic policy. The Federalists and Anti-Federalists formed around a single issue: ratification of the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists opposed it. They were led by Patrick Henry, George Clinton, Robert Yates, and others. Many Anti-Federalists took issue with the fact that the Constitution was drafted in secrecy. They also contended it was illegitimate and extra-legal, since the delegates in the Grand Convention were not authorized to scrap the articles. They were concerned that the new powers of the federal government under the Constitution infringed on state jurisdictions. Remember, state-level governance was the norm under the Articles, so states' rights was a contentious issue in the Great Debate. But the biggest objection put forth by the Anti-Federalists was the absence of a Bill of Rights in the Constitution. Henry and others pointed out that the Constitution featured pages and pages of enumerated governmental powers, but no explicit limits to those powers. The Anti-Federalists believed that a Bill of Rights was necessary to take power away from the federal government and return it to the people and states. At the core of the Anti-Federalist argument was the belief that tyranny could only be avoided and liberty could only be preserved with strict limits on governmental power. On the other side of the debate, the Federalists argued for the Constitution's speedy ratification. They were led by many of the Grand Convention delegates, including John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and the wordsmith of the Constitution himself, James Madison. The Federalists argued that in the absence of a stronger federal government, the country would descend into chaos, and Shays' Rebellion had already demonstrated the reality of this fear. They argued that a Bill of Rights was unnecessary because 8 states already had them in place. Hamilton even suggested that a Bill of Rights might encourage the expansion of federal power. He intimated that by explicitly protecting only certain freedoms, others might become vulnerable. Slowly, the states considered the question of the Constitution, and some started giving their approval. The ratification process and the actions that turned the tide in the Federalist favor are laid out in our third big idea. Thanks to the feverish efforts of Federalist leaders and the willingness of both sides to compromise, the Constitution was eventually ratified, and a Bill of Rights promptly added to it. When news of the Constitution first broke, its supporters were a distinct minority. But Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay slowly turned the tide. They wrote and distributed a series of 85 essays laying out the argument in favor of the Constitution. Collectively, these were known as the Federalist Papers. And though they were published anonymously, we now know that Hamilton was responsible for 51 of the essays, Madison 29, and Jay 5. Perhaps the most famous of the arguments were Federalist number 10 and 51, both the work of Madison. Federalist 10 argued that large republics were necessary to guard against corruption, and Federalist 51 explained that the checks and balances set forth in the Constitution would adequately protect against the ascent of a tyrant. The publications were a massive success. Slowly, the public grew confident in the Constitution and pressured their state legislatures to ratify it. But the Bill of Rights, or rather the lack thereof, remained a sticking point for the Anti-Federalists. So, with the finish line in sight, the two factions struck a deal. The Anti-Federalists agreed that the Constitution could be adopted as is, if the Federalists committed that among the first acts of the new Congress would be the addition of a Bill of Rights. The two sides agreed, and the deal was kept. New Hampshire became the 9th state to ratify the Constitution in June of 1788, and the new government began operating in March 1789. The first Congress drafted a Bill of Rights as promised, which was ratified in 1791. The Bill of Rights represent the first changes to the Constitution, which is why you know them as the first 10 amendments. The Bill of Rights remain one of the most relevant and often discussed parts of the U.S. Constitution today. And if you read between the lines, you can see the memory of the American independence movement in its construction. This is our final big idea. The Bill of Rights provides limits to the powers of the federal government by guaranteeing certain freedoms to the people. It traces its origins to the memory of British misrule during the independence movement. Many credit the framers of the Constitution for being forward-looking, anticipating the changes that the world would undergo after they passed American democracy onto their children. But I see them as backward-looking as well. The Bill of Rights, the fundamental freedoms protected by the Constitution, was clearly inspired by the founders' unpleasant history with the British monarchy. Many of the amendments seem to refer directly to events from the independence movement. Consider the First Amendment, which includes the freedom of speech and right to protest, two liberties that the British attempted to squelch in the wake of the Stamp Act, Townshend Act, and Coercive Acts. The Second Amendment protects the state's right to keep and regulate a militia. Remember how the Revolutionary War began? The Redcoats were marching to Concord to confiscate weapons belonging to the Massachusetts militia. The Third Amendment holds that no citizen may be forced to house soldiers, an obvious dig at the Quartering Act of 1774. The Fourth Amendment deals with your right to privacy and protects against unreasonable search and seizure. This amendment houses the memory of writs of assistance, which were commonly issued to British officials, allowing them to inspect colonial homes and ships for smuggled goods without a warrant. Amendments 5 through 8 all concern rights of the accused, which include a jury trial, the right to counsel, the right against self-incrimination, protection from double jeopardy, and more. These could be traced to a number of incidents during the independence movement, including the provision of the Stamp Act, which held that violators were not entitled to a jury trial, or the Administration of Justice Act, which whisked British officials away to Europe to face trials in the absence of their peers. The hypocrisy of the British justice system was certainly something the founders wished not to repeat. And so, while many other amendments have been added in the 230 years since the Constitution's ratification, these first 10 serve as our principal bulwark against runaway government power. They've served us well so far, but that does not make them invulnerable. Your generation may well face constitutional crises of unprecedented variety. And it is critical to remember that though words on a page may give us comfort, the real stewards of liberty are not a collection of articles or amendments. The real stewards of liberty are we, the people. Next time, we'll take a look at the Washington administration and set precedents that will endure for centuries. See you then.